Action. So, Shalom, Mark.
Shalom, מה נשמע?
בסדר, we're gonna make an interview for your family about your life. We start with the date, and today it's Wednesday, the 6th of July,
2023.
2023.
In Or Akiva.
In אור עקיבא. אני ארז מזרחי, מראיין את מארק
Mark Sherman.
שרמן.
Mendel.
And the first question that I'm going to ask you, Mark, it's about your family,
Okay.
about your parents, or if you remember more, your grandfather or grandmother. What you can say?
Okay.
What you can tell about them, where they come from, your grandfather, or even if you remember more, if you know about more generation.
I will
you're
try.
welcome to- Okay.
Lily, bring me my sunglasses because it's kind of bright.
Yeah.
I'm in the office. Okay. I will go from my memory and from what my parents told me. The family history, basically. I will start with my great-great-grandfather, Laser Burda. He was the grandfather of my grandmother and my grandfather on my father's side because they were first cousins. And he lived in or near Odessa in the Ukraine. He was born in 1810 and he lived to 99 years old and he died in 1909 or 1910 and he had 3 or 4 wives and a number of children. Like I said, he is the grandfather both of my father's mother and my father's father. My grandmother, on my father's side, she was born in Odessa in the Ukraine. And her mother, my great-grandmother, was from Austria. And my great-grandfather, on my father's side, my grandmother, my father's mother's father, either was in the army, in the Russian army, and he went to Austria, or he went to study in a yeshiva there, we're not sure. And then he met my great-grandmother, Razel Budner, I believe her name was, and they moved to Odessa in the Ukraine. My great-grandfather, my grandmother's father, on my father's side, sold kerosene for a living, like gas. They didn't have electricity. This is back in the late 1800s.
Oh.
And so he sold kerosene, and that was the way he made a living.
That was in Odessa.
In Odessa. He was a very religious man.
Okay.
And he always wanted to go to Israel, I heard. He never made it. Even though it wasn't that far away, but in those days it was a long distance in Odessa. Now my grandfather on my father's side, he is from a little village called Sarajevo, which
Sarajevo.
is Sarajevo or
Ah.
Sarajevo. You heard about it?
Sarajevo, it's in...
Not Sarajevo, Yugoslavia.
Okay, not Sarajevo,
That's a big
Yugoslavia.
city. This is Sarajevo. I know what you're thinking of.
Yes.
You're thinking of Sarajevo and
Yes, yes.
I think in Yugoslavia. No?
Yeah.
Okay, or Serbia. This is Sarajevo, a small little town with only maybe less than 100 families, Jewish families.
In Ukraine.
In a shtetl in the Ukraine, near Odessa.
What, a village of 100
A
families
village.
in Ukraine?
A village in the Ukraine.
Okay.
This is my father's
You
father.
know what they was working? What was they were occupying?
Let's see. I don't know what he did for what my great grandfather did for a living. They lived very hard and very poor, and they had a dirt floor, and they didn't, have a tile floor or wood floor. It was
That's
a dirt floor.
from stories from your father, or where from this?
From my father.
Okay.
He would tell me about his father,
Okay.
and he.
You didn't knew him.
I knew my grandfather.
Yeah, but not from...
But he didn't tell me stories. He
Okay.
told his son. He told my father the stories. But
Okay.
I knew a little bit, but not what I'm telling you now. What I'm telling you now about the dirt floor and everything, that's from my father. And he lived in, like I say, in a little town called Sarajevo. And on Shabbat, they would put new sawdust on the floor to make it fresh for Shabbat. Now he came to Portland, Oregon. He left the Ukraine something like around 1907 or 1908. And he came, he was like 15 years old. And he had an older brother already in Portland. But his name was Shochet, like Shochet. You know, one of those
Shochet, yeah.
yeah, slaughters the animal. But they changed the name to Sherman when he came to the immigration headquarters in New York, when he landed, or Montreal where they landed. They changed the name, the immigration officials, because they wanted to Americanize it, make it sound American.
Sherman, it's American
Sherman
name.
is an American sounding name, but the
What year was it?
1907 or 1908, something like that. And he
Before
came,
the World War One.
huh?
Before World War One.
Before World War One. World War One was 1914 and 1918.
So what was the reasons that they came to America?
Because it was very hard life for the Jews, the Jewish people. It was
Okay,
a lot of anti-Semitism. There was a lot of
Okay.
pogroms, you know, like fighting against the Jews and killing and so forth. Wasn't a good. Most of the family, my family, immigrated, left. Now a lot of my grandmother's brothers and sisters, whatever, moved to Argentina. Some came to Portland, Oregon. No, a couple. One or two of them went to Argentina because Jews either went to Argentina than Canada or the U.S.
And Brazil also.
Maybe Brazil, I'm not sure. Okay.
And South Africa also was a
South Africa, that's right.
Jewish
That's right.
community.
Yeah, some came to Palestine.
Yeah.
So he came at age 15, and he opened a hardware business with another friend of his from the same village where he grew up. And for 42 years, he had a hardware business in Portland, Oregon.
What do you mean hardware?
Hardware is like you said, kilim, like a hammer, patish, and masmarim, you know,
Okay,
nails.
working with steel.
Yeah, but selling, plumbing, you know, like fixing a toilet,
Yeah.
beit shemush, shibutin,
Yes.
parts for the,
Okay.
you know, it's a store, it's like home center, you know, but very small.
He used to sell in the store.
He was owner, baal of a store,
Okay.
like home center, but
Okay.
much smaller,
For hardware.
for hardware.
Okay.
Hardware store. This is
Okay.
my grandfather. And they,
In Oakland.
in Portland, Oregon.
In Portland, Oregon.
Okay. And he did that from about 1918, 1920 until 1962. That's when he retired, 1962. And he had four kids. One became a property manager or owner of real estate and managed real estate properties. Another one, the girl, my aunt, she married a life insurance salesman. And another one, an accountant, became an accountant. This is my father's brothers and sisters. Okay, so now let's go back. Let's talk now about my let's talk about get my train of thought. My grandfather and grandmother on my mother's side. My grandmother on my mother's side, her name was Rachel Kolish. Kolish. And she was from a little town, a small village in Lithuania, Lita, and it's near Vilna. And she had 7 or 8 brothers and sisters. And the name of the town was Shvenchenis, that she came from.
Shvenchenis.
Shvenchenis. And she came And they spoke Yiddish. Both of the grandparents on both sides were speaking Yiddish. That was their main language, was Yiddish. Not Lithuanian, not Russian. They spoke some Russian and some Lithuanian, but mostly Yiddish they would speak.
How they were speaking with the Goy?
I think they would speak in the Lithuanian or the Russian, yeah. That's what the Goy, I think that's what they did. The Ukrainian, they called themselves Russians in those days, not Ukrainians.
Yeah.
Because maybe Ukraine was part of Russia, so they called themselves Russian, not Ukrainian. My grandmother, she came alone from Lithuania to Winnipeg, Canada. And
Alone?
Winnipeg, Canada.
She came alone?
She came alone.
Well,
think
she left
came
her
alone.
family.
Yeah,
for
yeah. I
women,
don't
it's,
know the story. I don't know the story. What happened? But she came alone.
In what age, you know?
1910, 12, something.
No, what age she
Oh,
was?
she was 16, 18, something like that.
Wow.
Maybe she came with people. I really don't know.
But that's
The only story I remember is that she kept kosher and there was no kosher food on the ship, so she was forced to eat chazir, and she was so afraid that she was going to be punished. Hashem was going to punish her because she was eating chazir, because there was no kosher food.
Yeah.
And there was very bad conditions on the boat, on the ship coming in. So anyway, my grandfather, now that's an interesting story. He is from, my mother's father is from a town called Dnepropetrovsk. And Dnepropetrovsk, before World War I, was called Ekaterinoslav, which in Russian means Catherine, the city of Catherine, the Queen, Catherine the Great. Ekaterinoslav. Like I said, it became Dnepropetrovsk after World War I. And the communists took over. A big city in Ukraine. And this is also the main city where the Chabad movement started and grew.
In what city?
Dnepropetrovsk. Before Ekaterinoslav.
Okay.
And the chief rabbi, Mishnerson, and his father and grandfather, they're all from that same city. A large city in the Ukraine with lots of Jewish people, a lot of Hasidic people. And I'm named after my grandfather's father, Mendel Leib, but later it became Menachem, my Hebrew name. When I came to Israel in 1961 and worked on the kibbutz, they said you don't need a Yiddish name, you need a Hebrew name. So they gave me the name Menachem instead of Mendel. But anyway, my grandfather was in the Russian army, and because he was Jewish, they were mistreated. The Jews were mistreated in the army, and they could not rise above the rank of corporal. There was a law in Russia, and that was like a corporal, it was like private, and corporal, and then sergeant. But they couldn't rise very much in the Russian army if they were Jewish. And he was hit or beaten by his commander for something he did, I don't know what. And he got so mad, my grandfather, that he ran away from the Russian army. He came to Canada. And when he landed in Canada, in Winnipeg, he didn't have enough money to even buy a meal, but he stayed with his either cousins or uncles and aunts that were already there. And he was, I think, in his 20s then. Oh, to change the subject a bit, my other grandfather, when he left, he was only 15, and he came out of the Ukraine. He was on a railroad car, and he was holding on like that, kind of like, it wasn't very secure the way he was on the train, leaving Russia or leaving the Ukraine. So my grandfather, on my mother's side, worked in a grocery store. Later he bought a grocery. He got married and he had 2 kids, my mother and my uncle. And my uncle became an optometrist, eye doctor, and he also had a camera store in Winnipeg. But my grandfather, he had many businesses. His first business was he had a grocery store. And there's an interesting story that he was offered the opportunity to invest in a new company that was starting up in Canada, and he would have the rights to the sales of the product for all of Western Canada. And the product was Coca-Cola.
Really?
You know, and my grandmother was afraid of investing money in this company because it was too new and unknown, and she didn't know if it would be successful, so she wouldn't let him do it.
Wow.
Otherwise, he would have had the rights to all of Coca-Cola for half of Canada. This is back in the 1920s or whatever. So anyway, so he had a grocery store. Later on, he sold the grocery store, and then he bought a small company to make laundry detergent. Then he sold that company. He bought an old movie theater and then sold that later. What he would do is he'd buy companies, small companies, that were not doing well, that were having a hard time financially. And so he would build it up, improve it, and then sell it for profit. So that's how and then he bought a lot of property. So he died a very wealthy man. This is he died in 1962. Okay, so now let's talk about my parent. Any questions, Eris, you might have?
Okay.
So far it's
the poster.
interesting, but continue. You.
A poster.
Okay, no questions right now. Okay, call me. If you have a question, let me know.
Director.
Okay.
All right, so my mother grew up in Winnipeg.
I mean, it's
And there's an interesting story.
Winnipeg, it's in Canada.
Winnipeg is a central city, good question, central city in Canada, in the middle of Canada.
Okay.
And it's Winnipeg, Manitoba.
It's
Now-
a Jewish area or?
A lot of Jewish people.
Okay.
And my mother, as a young girl, like she was a teenager, 14, 15,
What
16.
was your mother's name?
Mona Wiseman.
Mona?
Mona, but in Hebrew Malka.
Okay.
Pessi Malka. Pessi Malka, named after my great-great-grandmother. My
Okay.
mother's grandmother, no, my great-grandmother, I think. Her name was Pessi Malka. My grandmother's mother.
Yes.
And that's who my mother was named after, Pessi Malka. So in English it was Mona Patricia, her name.
Okay.
Now, my grandfather and my grandmother were Zionists. They were always believers in a Jewish homeland. And they were very active in the Jewish community in Winnipeg in raising money for Palestine, the Jews in the yeshiva. And my mother was a young member of Hadassah. Are you familiar with Hadassah?
Yeah.
Okay, so she,
Neshot Hadassah.
huh?
It's called Neshot Hadassah. I know Neshot Hadassah. It means Neshot Nashim.
Nashim, women.
Yeah. Women of Hadassah.
Women of Hadassah.
Yes.
Yeah. And they built the Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem.
Yes.
Okay. So my mother was very active in Winnipeg with Hadassah. And there's a story that around 1936, Golda Meirson, who later became Golda Meir, was sent by Ben Gurion to Canada and the U.S. because she spoke English well. So she worked with Hadassah and these different organizations in raising money for Palestine. So my mother met her, and they became friends, and they worked together in Winnipeg for I don't know for how long. And my mother tells the story how Golda Meir wanted to take my mother, like adopt her, so to speak, and take her back to Israel or Palestine at that time with her. But my grandparents were against it. You okay?
רוצה לשאול?
No.
או.
Okay. So anyway, my grandparents were against it, but it's an interesting story. Let's see. Portland older brother, where is it? I'm going back over my notes. My mother and my father were married in 1941 in Portland, Oregon. My mother had come down to visit some cousins of hers in 1940, and in 1941 they were married in November. It was during World War II, the beginning of World War II, the U.S. entry into World War II, and my father was working for the American Red Cross at that time, and they settled in Portland. I was born in Portland, but because of the war and my father's work, he had to leave home. My mother was alone with me, the first child, so she took me to Winnipeg as a baby. And so the first 2 years of my life I spent with my mother's parents and my mother in Winnipeg. And my father served in the U.S. Army at the end of towards the end of the war, but he was not overseas. He was stationed. He was stationed in the U.S. Let's see. My father's sister.
What he was doing in the army?
Pardon me.
What is what was he doing in the army? What was
My father was working in an office to give medals, to give like awards to people.
Okay.
So he was like in the office to process the giving of the awards.
Okay.
My father.
Like who is deserved to get a medal?
Who deserved to get a medal and so forth.
Okay.
He didn't make the main decision, but he
that.
was doing the paperwork or whatever
Okay.
in an office. Now, my uncle, my father's brother, younger brother, was in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, and he was in Belgium. And this is in 1944, and he was in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge. This is my father's brother. And my father's sister's husband, he was an active fighter in France and Italy during World War II. I should also mention that my mother's father's family, we know nothing about them. They didn't come, I think maybe they didn't come to the U.S. or Canada or whatever. All communication stopped with them. They were in the Ukraine, and during World War II, everything stopped. No more mail, no more letters. So the family thing, we think that they were killed by the Nazis, but we're not sure. But that's most likely what happened, is that they got killed.
Until now, you don't know
But
what happened.
we don't know
with them.
because they didn't leave. My grandfather, my mother's father's brothers and sisters, we know nothing about them. They stayed in Russia or Ukraine, and they used to write letters back and forth. But when World War II came, all the correspondence stopped.
You didn't try to get
They
information
tried, but
from
there was nothing.
Yad
It was
Vashem?
war. It was time of war.
No, not now. After now.
Oh,
like,
now.
From Yad Vashem, you didn't try to get the details about their names.
You know, that's a good question.
What?
I mean, that's a good idea.
Okay.
We should do that, you know?
Yeah, it's
This would be my father's,
Brothers.
my mother's father's brothers and sisters. Except the one my mother's father's father, my great-grandfather, I'm named after him, Mendel. He came to Canada, and I think it was after my great-grandmother passed away. So, because he died as an old man in Winnipeg, Canada in 1936.
36.
36. Now, we don't know what happened to them. Like I said, the brothers and sisters of my grandfather, we should try, but we're not sure if the name was spelled differently, because his name is Wiseman, Wiseman. It could be Weissman or Weissman or something else. You know?
But if you try, I think there is some people that can help you with the information, the details about the places, the area that they lived in family.
Yeah, they lived in Dnepropetrovsk, which is a couple hours from Kiev. And Kiev is where Baba Yar
Yeah.
was, you know.
Yeah, but they have a lot of information, you know. They investigate it for all the time since then. They
Okay.
investigate names and places and area, and they know.
It's an idea. We should do that, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, good idea.
Maybe you find them that they also survive, you know, but they didn't know the address in Canada or whatever, and they survive, and maybe not they, but the children or grandchildren, maybe they live in Israel. You don't know. It's gonna be, yeah, you know, from this meeting.
I could have cousins.
Yeah.
Now, it wouldn't be first cousin, it would be second cousin, wouldn't it? Yeah, yes, it would be brothers and sisters of my grandfather, their grandchildren, be second and third cousins of mine.
Yeah.
Could be living in Israel, right? Idea. Okay. Any other questions, or I should go on?
No, continue.
Okay. Let's see. I'm going through my notes here. My father, after World War II, became a social worker because he studied at the University of Portland for his bachelor's degree, and then he got his graduate work he did at Notre Dame University, which was in Indiana. He had a degree in social work and became the director of the Lane County Juvenile Department in Eugene, Oregon. We moved to Eugene in 1948. He worked for the Circuit Court of Lane County, and he basically was in charge of young boys and girls, but mostly young boys who got in trouble with the law, would get in trouble with the police or whatever.
In what place?
Eugene, Oregon.
Oregon.
Now, how about 2-hour drive by car south of Portland, Oregon?
Okay.
And then he did that for, about, 7 years. And then he left that work and opened a dry cleaning business with my mother. And, like dry cleaning, you know what
Yeah, laundry.
Laundry dry cleaning business. And he did that for 10 years. After that, he went back to social work and was working at the University of Oregon in what's called the VISTA program, which is like the Peace Corps, training college-age volunteers to go out and work in the communities and to help people in poor places. Later, after that, he became an official with the U.S. Bankruptcy Court in Eugene, Oregon, as a trustee. So he worked basically when people would go bankrupt, and the court would take over the assets or the other money, and they would manage it for the people that went bankrupt. So he was a trustee. He was working in that field for a number of years, and then he retired. He also had some properties, and he did some property management. Both my mother and my father were extremely active in the Jewish community in Eugene, Oregon. My father was president of the synagogue once or twice. He also was the head of the United Jewish Appeal, which is like a Eugene federation, which is raising money for Jewish causes. And he did that for many years as a leader of fundraising. And my mother was active in Hadassah, the Women's Zionist organization. My father also spoke at different schools and clubs, organizations about Judaism. People would ask him. It's a small town. Eugene,
used to visit in Israel?
Eugene was a small town. What?
Your parents used to live to visit in Israel?
My parents came to Israel one time in 1969.
Okay.
They were only here one time. My grandfather, my mother's father, he was here twice. His first trip was in 1952, and his second trip was in 1961. When I came to Israel for the first time, as a volunteer, Mitnadev, at Magan Michael, and my grandfather was here at the same time. And my grandmother had passed away by then, and he married another woman. That he had a second wife for the last 2 years of his life, and so he came twice to Israel because he's very Zionistic, very active in helping Israel financially.
You used to stay where what do you like to do in Israel, you know?
Say it again?
Your grandfather,
Yes.
when he came to Israel, where he used to stay, what he liked to do in Israel?
I think he was in the Tel Aviv area mostly, but I'm not sure. I can't remember what he used to do. We travel, I know that, but to see, but I don't know what he did. I can't remember.
He was a religious guy?
No, I mean he was religious, but in the like you would call Masorti.
Yeah.
He wouldn't be with the tzitzit, and he didn't have a hat or whatever, and he would drive on Shabbat, I think. But my grandmother and on both my mother's side and my father's side, both my grandparents would not eat any pork, and they all kept kosher. They kept separate dishes. I think they kept separate. I know my mother and my grandparents on my mother's side kept, chalav and basar separate. The dishes. I'm not sure about my grandparents on my father's side, but they wouldn't eat meat and milk together. They could separate it.
Yeah.
But I know my grandparents on my father's side, on my mother's side, didn't wait 6 hours to eat. They waited 2 hours. That was their rule. They would wait 2 hours before if they meet, before they would eat.
So they like Masortim, but not conservative like Americans conservative.
Between Masorti and Orthodox.
Okay.
Not really Orthodox.
Yeah.
But it kind of like,
there is a difference.
But they're almost like Dati, what do you call it, Zionist, Dati Zioni?
Okay.
It's almost like that.
Yeah.
But not exactly.
Like conservative,
Religious Zionism. Hard to say.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Let's see here. I had a younger brother and sister, and my younger brother, David, had 2 children and lived in Yakima, Washington, and he was a deputy district attorney for a number of years. My sister, Francine, who married a Rheingold, was a teacher. She was a school teacher, elementary, for young kids for many years, was a teacher, and she married a man, my brother-in-law, Jeff Rheingold, who was a property developer and manager of property for, people would buy properties, investment properties, and he would manage it for them. He still does that today. I grew up with my brother and my sister and my parents in Eugene, Oregon from 1948, and I stayed there until 1966 when I was drafted in the U.S. Army at the time of the Vietnam War. In high school, I was active in drama, theater, and also was active in theater and acted in plays, both in high school and in the university. I majored in drama, and I went into, was drafted.
Why did you go to the theater and drama?
Why?
You plan to work in that, or just like it was a hobby?
At that time, I kind of had an idea. I'd like to be an actor, but not really serious. But I think I always wanted to be a teacher of drama.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I became a teacher later on of drama, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. I went into went to school at University of Oregon from 61 to 66. I went in the Army in 1966, but I wasn't, thank God, I didn't get stationed in Vietnam. I was in the U.S. I was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington, and I was stationed in Fort Huachuca, Arizona, and then later I was stationed at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, the Brooke Army Medical Center. And I became a medical records clerk working in a hospital, Army
Medical
hospital.
records?
Medical records. You know how you used to say Siudin?
Okay. Equipment?
Not equipment as much as records, like papers, Nayeret.
Okay, yeah.
How do you say in Hebrew that?
Like
Records.
Archeon.
Okay, like history.
Yes.
Ma'abadot, the lab reports, the blood tests, the Shetin tests, you know.
Okay.
You know, and put the files, you know, tikim.
Tikim, it's Archeon.
Oh, Achayon?
Archeon, how it's called Archeon in English? Never mind. Continue.
Okay. Yeah, I thought Tziyud, a record was Tziyud, no? Tziyud is equipment?
Yeah.
Oh.
Record list, I don't know the word, but could be also
Okay.
Tziyud.
Anyway, so I was in medical records, like in charge of the files of people that would be patients in the hospital and the dependents, like the children and the husband or the wife of the soldiers would go to the army hospital for treatment, and we.
Archive.
What's that?
Archive.
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 Archive is for, okay, the archive is more like, something put away, like inactive, like you don't use it anymore.
Okay, yeah.
Archive is like you put it away and you're not going to use it.
Yes.
I'm talking about like medical records is like the tikkun, the historia, file, the history, but not archives exactly. Archive is like you don't use it.
You use it
But-
if you need the history.
Okay. Anyway, so that was the job in the army.
Okay. Why did you get this job? You wasn't, how many?
Well-
you couldn't be a fighter or something
Well,
because
because-
medical.
Because they give you a lot of tests when you go in the army. You've been in the army?
Yes.
Okay. So they give you a lot of tests when you come in at the beginning, the first day or two.
Yes.
And you take tests, what you would be good at.
Okay.
You know, and because I had education, I had a college degree and everything. They said, okay, they sent me to clerk typist school to type. And then they took the best group, the ones who did the best job in the class. They sent 10 of us to mortuary school and 10 of us to medical history school.
Okay.
Mortuary is like when like Chabra Kedusha, preparing the papers
For death.
for the dead people. So
Okay.
one group went there and the other group went to
The
the
medical.
hospital to learn medical records. But from the school, the clerk typist school.
How you felt about the war, the Vietnam War in that time? Did you
At
wanted
that
to
time,
do?
I
You
wasn't-
wanted to be there? You was
I wasn't
afraid? You was
against
against it?
I
You
wasn't against it at that time. Later on, I became against it. In the 70s.
When you've been in the army or after the army?
I was in the army because we were told lies about it by the government. Basically,
It's very strange to think about the war that you fight for other nations.
People were not against it so much in the army. People were not against it. It was later. It seemed like 2, 3 years, 5 years later, the war lasted longer, and the government kept saying it's going to be over in 6 months. We're going to be done in 3 months, and they never did. They lied. So
Yeah.
people got dissatisfied, and there was a lot of bad behavior of the army over there, but we didn't know it at that time.
Yeah.
And so we weren't against it. I wasn't against
Wasn't
it.
the movie didn't came out yet? The
Those
Hollywood
movies,
movie,
all that came
like
out later.
Apocalypse Now. You
And
remember
Platoon
Platoon
and
but
Casualties of War.
the most famous, I think, it's
Full Metal Jacket. All these movies came out in the 80s, 90s, or 70s, 80s.
70s.
70s.
Apocalypse Now, what year was it? 70s?
Vietnam War started in 1961 and ended in 75. Long war, 14 years. But it was big, it wasn't big, it wasn't going strong until 65. 61 to 65 it was small. Then it became bigger and bigger and bigger. In 65 to 75 it was big. Like by 1965 there was 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam, 500,000 soldiers. Before 1965, like 63, 62, there was like 70,000, 75,000 Americans.
Soldier was serving.
So the build-up happened later.
Yeah.
And that's why the people that started becoming against the war was in the late 60s, but we didn't feel it in the army. It's like if you're out of the army in the streets, you would see it, but not on the army base. And it wasn't until the 70s, the 70, 72, 73, then there was a lot of bad feeling about it because the war was going on. The public was getting tired of it, pretty much. Anything else on that?
Continue.
Okay. Let's see here. I came out of the army. I got an early discharge to go back to school. You know, went to school to get a master's degree for teaching in high school. And I wanted, like I said earlier, I wanted to teach drama, teach speech and drama and English. So I went for a master's degree at the University of Portland.
University of?
Pardon me?
University of?
Portland.
Portland.
Portland. A small school in Portland, Oregon, and I was teaching part-time to help, you know, the family because I was married. I got married at that time, and then we had Michelle, the first daughter. Oh, can't talk about that, huh? You don't want to talk about that, Lily? No? Well, then they're not going to know anything about your family or nothing. It's going to be a big mystery.
Yeah, it is.
We're going to have to meet some other time to talk about that. I have lots of stories I can tell we could talk about, right? I didn't talk about getting married, did I?
No, please.
I got married in 1968.
In 68?
Yes. To Lily David.
Wow.
Look. He ordered this.
Oh, yeah.
Too bad.
Oh, that's what I was talking about, a clapboard.
Yeah.
That's for my grandson.
No, I understand that I came to the right place in the right time.
Yeah, you can use it. You can
No,
use
also I'm speaking with a drama teacher, so
Yeah.
also can give me a few
Okay.
tips.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Married in 1968 to Lily David.
Oh, don't.
No?
No.
Okay, well, it's too
I
late.
told you, no.
Okay.
You can erase it.
All right. Graduate
Yeah.
school, the University of
Because I will
Portland.
see it, I will tear it, break the whole thing.
Graduate school
Oiga, voy. Tequito.
for 2 years, 1968 to 1970.
Tequito.
And I also taught at the university one class in speech while I was going to school to help make money for school. Got a job teaching in Coos Bay, Oregon in the 1970s. From 1970 to 74, we lived in Coos Bay, Oregon. And that was on the Oregon coast. And I became a speech and drama teacher and directed school plays and managed their auditorium in the large high school in that city of about 10,000 population on the Oregon coast.
Well, 10,000 population was the city?
The population of the city is about 10,000, 15,000.
It's small, it's not big.
Small city.
Yeah.
Big high school though. 1,500, I think 1,500 kids, 1,500 kids.
Well, it's not only from the city, it's
From the surrounding areas.
okay.
And left there in 1974 and came back to Portland, Oregon to study. I wanted to study educational administration, school administration, which is like learning to be a school principal in Minnehaha Beit Sefer. So I wanted to learn that. So I went back to school and did that for a year.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you again, back. You went to the army in what year?
1966.
66. 67 was the 6 Days Wars in Israel.
In 6-Day War, I was in San Antonio, Texas. I remember that.
Did you was
I was in Texas.
did you was interested, excited
Yes.
about the
We
war?
were excited about that. And everybody around, even the Goyim, were excited
Really?
about that because people were, I remember people in the army in Goyim and
It was like a miracle. for
like
them.
they saying how a small country like that can be unified, especially in the army people.
Yeah.
I was with, because you know, the idea of being a strong army and a unified, to be able to win over all such odds against other, you know, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, you know,
Iraq even.
Iraq, yeah, you know, how it was a miracle in 6 days. So we were talking about it. And I was in the army barracks, I remember, in San Antonio, Texas. It was in June of 1967. I remember that very clearly.
And you remember the community also, you like your parents and the community was like celebrating?
Yeah, everybody was, everybody, you know, I remember, you know, a lot of times people didn't feel good about being Jewish, especially, you know, before that. And it was like
Why was...
the anti-Semitism or maybe,
was anti-Semitism in America at that time?
there was anti-Semitism. I suffered anti-Semitism as a child.
Well, in school?
In school.
From children?
From other kids.
Yeah.
They said, you killed Jesus.
Really?
You know, and I remember being chased around the playground.
Well, that was mainly from the Catholic, yeah? Or it doesn't matter?
This was Protestant too.
Yeah?
Yeah, it was when I was 6 years old, 7 years old. I remember being picked on, being Jewish. And also, they would sing Christmas songs and celebrate Christmas. We didn't do that. We felt bad about that, you know. But what I'm saying, you were asking about the 6-Day War. I think it brought a lot of pride to people. A lot of the Jewish people, myself included, felt good. Here, the Jews are strong and they can do something, and they think, you know, very, very feel good about what they did, and it gave them confidence and pride. Because look what happened in World War II, you know, and
yeah, exactly.
see, a lot of people. I remember a teacher saying to me in a class in high school, "Why the Jews went like sheep to the car, you know. They didn't realize what the Nazis did. They would starve people and not give them any drink or water for 2 days. And they didn't know where they were going, so they didn't have any energy, and they were sick, whatever, when they arrived. So they would take them to the slaughter, you know. So a lot of people say, how come the Jews didn't fight back? You know,
At that time, they was fighting, fought back, but
there was a
not
few
many.
cases. There was a few like like Analepsky in the Warsaw Ghetto,
Okay,
but-
Warsaw.
but the majority, there was no fight resistance.
They wasn't preparing for
They
fighting.
weren't prepared for it, and they didn't know where they were going. Maybe they were going to go to a labor camp or whatever.
Yes.
They didn't tell them where we were, and they kept them awake and on cattle cars for 2 days. By the time they got there, they were so tired and sleepy and hungry and
Yeah,
whatever.
of course, we cannot.
But so, you know, how can they fight back? But so a lot of people, you know, would say, why the Jews didn't fight back, this and that. And then the 6-Day War came, and it showed how strong the Jews could be with Israel. It gave a lot of pride to people in the diaspora in the Galut. Became very proud of Israel.
That's nice to hear.
Yeah.
But after was the Yom Kippur War.
Then the Yom Kippur War came, but I don't think in the U.S. that American Jews really understood how dangerous, how negative it was on the Jewish people in Israel at that time.
It was dangerous.
It was dangerous, and it almost lost the war. There were a lot of casualties. There were a lot of people killed and became wounded because it was a surprise attack, and they weren't prepared for it. But we didn't.
Some people think the victory in Yom Kippur was bigger than 6 Days War.
The victory at the end.
Yeah.
With Sharon.
With all the casualties. Because it was.
With Sharon and they would have.
Sharon and with the Kalani in the
Golani in Syria.
In the Golan in Syria.
It turned around.
Because the surprises.
Kissinger in the U.S. stopped it, and because of Russia told Israel to stop. Because they could have wiped out Syria, or could have wiped out Egypt.
Yeah. At the end, yeah.
But what I'm trying to say is the Yom Kippur War, the Americans, Canadians didn't realize the damage it did to Israel. Not being prepared, and the number of casualties and things like that.
Why didn't you realize it was
the reports? There weren't that many reports coming out. I don't know. As I remember, that's how it was.
Okay, it wasn't. How you got the report? Was no CNN at that time. It was.
There weren't newscasters saying, "Oh, the Israelis suffered this," or these many soldiers died, and these are many.
But it was newspapers and magazines and Time.
But the majority didn't know. There wasn't the reports, as I remember, unless I'm remembering it wrong. That's. And there was a delay. I do remember there was a delay. Golda Meir, they needed equipment. They needed the equipment from the U.S.
Yes.
And they didn't answer right away. There was a delay of a few days or a week or two, whatever. They finally gave them that. Kissinger said no, but Nixon, the president, went above his head and said, no, we're going to give him help, but it was a delay. And because it was a delay, Israel wasn't prepared, didn't have the tanks or the airplanes or whatever it was.
Parts, there wasn't the part.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, I don't remember. I was very young, I was 4 years old in that war. But I heard about the embargo on Israel.
Yes, right.
And
it caused the shakeup of the Israeli government. Golda Meir lost her prime ministership, and Moshe Dayan, he felt so bad, he got sick, he had cancer, and he died.
Yeah, after the war, yeah.
Moshe Dayan, and Sharon was a leader, and he was. I read his book. It was about his biography, how he was right about so many things, and the other soldiers, other generals were against him. There was a big conflict in the high command of Israel of how to deal with the situation. But it was Sharon's army in Egypt that really, they surrounded the soldiers in Egypt and almost wiped them out. Okay, so let's get back to, let's see, grad school in 1975, studying to be a school principal, administrator, and then we went to Alaska for 2 years. Lived in Alaska. Our two girls, Michelle and Galila, were very young, and we lived in a little village called Antioch the first year. And that was That was an Eskimo village.
Well, what was the reasons to go to Alaska?
I was offered a job as an assistant to a superintendent to be the second in command of 16 schools, small schools in Alaska. I did that for a year, and then it was a temporary job while they were reorganizing some things. And the next year after that, we were in an Indian village, and it's called Nalato, mostly Indian, and I was a principal of a school of about 150 kids from kindergarten through high school. So there was like 5 teachers only, small school, and a village of about 500 people. And the only way you could get to that village was by air. You couldn't drive there. It was by small airplane.
Really?
And
that was when you were with the daughters, with the kids, yeah?
the kids were real young. And we did a lot of small flying, not as a pilot, but as a passenger in small planes. You know, 2-seater, 4-seater, 6-seater.
It's scary in the small planes.
Cessna,
Yeah.
airplanes. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's beautiful, but it's scary.
The first year I was an assistant to a superintendent. I would go visit these 16 schools all around the area, fly from one to the other, and just make sure that the maintenance of the furnaces were working. And the
Did you
plumbing.
like it?
I liked it. The plumbing was okay, and the electricity, and evaluate the teachers to see if they needed anything. And
How was the communication with the local people, with the Indian?
it was okay. I mean, they spoke English and everything. A lot of times they didn't like, though, they didn't like people from outside of Alaska. They like more their own people.
Okay.
So there's some resentment there. But basically, get along, okay. So I did that, and then came back to Portland, and then to work for a school district in Portland. I worked as a teacher in a jail for kids that were going to prison. So it was like a prison for kids that were committed crimes.
Teacher of what?
Pesha, crimes.
No, but you was the teacher
I'm
of
teaching high school.
what subject you teach?
All subjects. It was like you teach everything: reading, writing,
Okay.
math, history, whatever. But it's a short-term school. The kids are only in school for a few days or a week or 2 weeks, and they come and go because they would get arrested and they would come to school, whatever. The court would send them to somewhere else or whatever.
You was influenced from your father
Yeah,
of the social worker.
the social worker, exactly. Because he was in something similar.
Yeah, so.
So I did that for 6 years, and then I went to work in a different school for work experience. Kids that were at risk for dropout, kids that were almost ready to drop out of school. They weren't doing well, like special education, but not exactly special education,
Okay.
which is special in Hebrew. That would be chinuch miyuchet.
Yes, חינוך מיוחד.
Miuchad, special education. So kids were not in small classes, and kids were half a day studying and then half a day working in the community, like in a bank or in a post office or in a government building or a store or whatever. And the other half, it's called work experience, career work experience. So I did that from let's see, when was that? 1986 to 1994. Right. In 95, retired. Went to sell furniture and work in security in Portland. Drove a school bus later on, and then worked at the airport as a shuttle bus driver for a number of years, and that's basically it. So we can go back, ask me questions. That's my prepared That's an hour we talked, I think, but
Yeah, we'll make a stop.
I don't know, is that enough, or do you want to go back and